Before we expose the secrets they buried with the city, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the Resident Evil deep dives. These are 50 disturbing facts about Raccoon City that never made it into the official reports. The establishment of Raccoon City in the American Midwest was not the result of organic urban growth or the natural movement of pioneers, but was instead a meticulously planned corporate maneuver by the Umbrella Corporation. The primary reason for this specific geographic selection was strategic isolation. Umbrella executives recognized that the surrounding Arklay Mountains provided a perfect natural containment zone. This geographic isolation made it significantly easier to hide the massive industrial signatures required for viral development, such as high-energy thermal output and chemical waste processing that would have been flagged by environmental agencies in a major coastal metropolitan area. By placing their primary research hub in a remote valley, Umbrella could operate with a level of secrecy that was physically impossible elsewhere. The mountains were not just a scenic backdrop, they were the perimeter of a global laboratory. Furthermore, the municipality was developed as a model city front, which was essentially a modern corporate colony. Every major urban renewal project, from the sprawling subway network to the high-tech city zoo, was funded directly or indirectly by Umbrella. This was not an act of philanthropy, but a calculated effort to create a dependent population. By providing nearly 30% of the city's total jobs, the corporation ensured that the citizenry would never question the expansion of pharmaceutical plants or the transport of hazardous materials through residential neighborhoods. The people of Raccoon City were encouraged to view Umbrella as a benevolent guardian, but the reality was that they were inhabitants of a controlled environment. Every piece of public infrastructure was built with the secondary purpose of facilitating the movement of biological assets, or providing data on how a modern workforce reacts to specific environmental stresses. The dependency was so total that the city government was effectively a subsidiary of the corporation. The mayor and the city council were selected based on their willingness to approve zoning permits for underground excavations that the public was never told about. This relationship turned the city into an umbrella colony, where the interests of the shareholders were always placed above the safety of the residents. When residents noticed the strange blue medical trucks moving through the streets at 3 a.m, they were told it was simply the progress of a booming economy. This psychological manipulation was a core component of why the city existed. It was a place where human beings were treated as variables, and the city itself was the petri dish. The strategic isolation ensured that when the experiments inevitably failed, the damage could be contained within the valley, while the model's city front ensured that the victims were already conditioned to follow corporate instructions without question. The sorrow of Raccoon City lies in the fact that its very existence was a lie. The families who moved there for the high-paying jobs and the modern amenities were unknowingly signing up to be part of a 30-year experiment in social and biological engineering. The Arklay Mountains were the walls of their prison, and the corporate funding was the chain that kept them in place. Umbrella did not just build a city, they built a harvesting ground. They knew that one day the research would escape, and they wanted a controllable environment where they could measure the lethality of their products on a diverse urban demographic. This was the dark purpose of the Midwest selection, a place far enough away from the world to be forgotten, but populated enough to provide significant tactical data. Part 2. The city's dark pre-Umbrella. History, long before the infamous events of September 1998. The ground beneath Raccoon City was already poisoned by the presence of the Umbrella Corporation. The early history of the region is defined by an industrial taint that originated from Umbrella's initial management of local mining operations. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the company used the guise of metal extraction to begin the massive excavations for what would later become the laboratory complexes. The runoff from these early projects was heavily contaminated with chemical stabilizers and primitive viral agents that were leaked into the local soil and water tables. This meant that for decades, the residents of the city were absorbing low levels of toxins through the very ground they walked on. The soil was saturated with a chemical signature that was unique to the Arklay region, making it a biological wasteland years before the first zombie appeared. This environmental degradation led to the creation of scrubbed mortality rates by the Umbrella-funded Board of Health. Internal corporate memos from the 1980s reveal a statistically impossible spike in rare cancers, neurological disorders, and chronic respiratory illnesses specifically within the Cedar District. These were not natural occurrences, but were the direct result of the industrial taint in the water supply. However, because Umbrella controlled the medical research grants and the local media, these clusters were officially classified as isolated incidents or the result of individual lifestyle choices. The corporation spent millions of dollars on public relations campaigns to deflect any blame from their chemical plants, and they utilized their influence to ensure that no federal investigation ever took place. The health of the population was being systematically eroded, and the records of this decline were buried deep within corporate archives. The darkness of this pre-outbreak era was the realization that Umbrella was using the population as a long-term study on toxic exposure. They were interested in how the human body responded to the early precursors of the T virus, and the chemical runoff provided a perfect unintentional trial. The sorrow of this period was the plight of the local miners and laborers who were the first to suffer from the corporate negligence. They were the ones who breathed in the dust of the excavations and drank the water from the contaminated wells. When they became ill, they were treated at Umbrella-funded clinics where their symptoms were documented for research purposes but never cured. This created a culture of silent suffering in the older parts of the city, where the high mortality rate was accepted as a normal part of life in an industrial town. The legacy of the pre-Umbrella history is a city that was biologically compromised from its inception. The residents were already weakened by decades of exposure to corporate waste, which likely contributed to the rapid spread of the T virus during the final outbreak. Their immune systems were already fighting a battle against the industrial taint, making them the perfect hosts for a viral takeover. This was the hidden foundation of Raccoon City, a place where the air, soil, and water were all weaponized by a corporation that viewed human life as a renewable resource. The scrubbed mortality rates were the first indicator of the mass death to come serving as a silent warning that the world ignored for the sake of corporate progress. Part 3. Umbrella's first hidden facilities. The physical infrastructure of Raccoon City was a complex web of deception, designed to hide the massive research complexes that operated beneath the streets. These were the first hidden facilities, which were often built using public funds under the guise of infrastructure modernization. When the city announced the construction of a new subway line or an advanced sewage treatment plant, Umbrella was the primary contractor overseeing the projects. This allowed them to redirect immense amounts of earth and materials to build the nest and other subterranean laboratories without raising suspicion. The tunnels of the public transit system often ran parallel to high-security research corridors. separated only by a few feet of reinforced concrete. The citizens were literally riding the train to work, while inches away, scientists were engineering the extinction of the human race. The construction of these hidden facilities was a feat of engineering and criminal conspiracy. To maintain the secrecy of the project, Umbrella utilized a system of compartmentalized labor, where no single contractor had the full blueprints of the city's underworld. This ensured that the true scale of the underground expansion remained a corporate secret. However, this secrecy required the elimination of anyone who looked too closely, leading to the phenomenon of vanished whistleblowers. Dozens of city engineers, architects, and construction foremen disappeared during the 1990s after questioning the undocumented ventilation shafts or the massive power consumption of supposedly abandoned sublevels. These individuals were either bribed into silence, or more frequently, they were removed from the census entirely. Their disappearance was written off as the result of the city's growing crime rate, but the truth was that they had stumbled upon the heart of the corporate beast. The iron reality of these facilities was that they turned the city into a functional laboratory where every pipe and wire served the mission of the T-virus. The sewage system was specifically modified to allow for the disposal of biological waste, which would eventually become the primary vector for the city's downfall. The first hidden facilities were not just places of research. They were the veins and arteries of a corporate predator. By the time the facilities were fully operational in the mid-90s, the city was essentially a hollow shell sitting on top of a massive biological weapon. The subway was not for the people. It was a transportation network for viral samples and research personnel. The power grid was not for the homes. It was to maintain the cryogenic stasis of the BOW units waiting in the dark. The sorrow of the hidden facilities was the total betrayal of the public trust. The people of Raccoon City believed they were paying taxes for a better life, but they were actually funding their own execution. The vanished whistleblowers were the only ones who saw the truth, but their voices were silenced by the very infrastructure they helped build. This era of secret expansion proved that Umbrella did not fear the law, because they had rewritten the architecture of the city to serve as their shield. They were hidden in plain sight, protected by the very urban environment they had manufactured. The Nest was the ultimate expression of this arrogance, a palace of rot buried deep beneath the unsuspecting families of the Midwest. Part 4. The medical system was already corrupt. The healthcare network in Raccoon City was perhaps the most sinister example of corporate infiltration. The city's medical system was already corrupt long before the T-virus was released, because it functioned as a data harvesting operation for the Umbrella Corporation. Institutions like Raccoon General Hospital were not primarily concerned with patient care, but with identifying specific genetic markers that would be useful for viral compatibility testing. Every blood sample taken during a routine checkup and every biopsy performed in the surgical wing was shared with Umbrella research labs. The hospital was a processing center where the population was screened for their potential as biological test subjects. Patients who showed high compatibility with specific viral strains were often subjected to fake clinical trials, where they were injected with experimental compounds under the guise of life-saving medication. These fake clinical trials were a core part of the medical corruption. Umbrella would identify individuals with rare blood types or specific immune responses and recruit them into studies for new pharmaceutical breakthroughs. In reality, these patients were being used as live human subjects for the refinement of viral stabilizers and mutation inhibitors. The doctors overseeing these programs were often corporate operatives who prioritized data collection over patient survival. When a patient inevitably died due to the experimental treatment, the hospital would falsify the death certificate to list the cause as natural complications or pre-existing conditions. This ensured that the mortality rate of the trials remained hidden, while Umbrella gathered the critical data needed to perfect their biological weapons. The hospital was not a sanctuary, but a slaughterhouse with a clinical facade. Furthermore, the medical system was used to track the spread of early accidental leaks. When residents of the Cedar District began showing symptoms of the industrial taint mentioned in previous sections, the hospitals were instructed to record the progression of the illness without providing effective treatment. Umbrella wanted to see how the human body decayed under the influence of their chemical waste. This was the ultimate violation of the Hippocratic Oath, where the entire medical profession of a city was subverted to serve the interests of a bioweapon manufacturer. The nurses and staff who noticed the discrepancies in patient care were often threatened with the loss of their licenses, or worse, ensuring that the corruption remained a well-kept secret. The sorrow of the Raccoon City medical system was the betrayal of the vulnerable. The sick and the elderly went to the hospital looking for help, and instead they were turned into variables in a corporate equation. Their suffering was measured, documented, and sold to the highest bidder in the global bioweapon market. This corruption meant that when the actual outbreak occurred, the city had no defensive medical infrastructure. The hospitals were already compromised, and the staff was already conditioned to follow umbrella protocols, even as the city burned around them. The medical system was the first line of defense that had been turned into the first line of infection. Part 5. Orphans, prisoners, and the uncounted. The most harrowing aspect of the pre-outbreak era was the systematic targeting of the city's most vulnerable populations. Umbrella utilized the Raccoon City orphanage and the local prison system as sources for a disposable population of unregistered test subjects. Because these individuals were often without families or legal representation, their disappearance would not trigger an investigation by the police or the media. The corporation established a partnership with the city's foster care system and the penal department, ensuring a steady stream of uncounted individuals for their most dangerous experiments. These were the people who existed on the margins of society, and in the eyes of Umbrella, they were nothing more than raw biological material. The connection between the Raccoon City orphanage and the research facilities was solidified through the Wish House connection. Children who were identified as having high genetic potential were selected by Umbrella recruiters and moved to the nest via a secret elevator hidden within the orphanage building. Once inside the laboratory, these children were stripped of their identities and given research numbers. Because they were never officially adopted or moved to another facility, they simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. They never appeared on a census or a death certificate. They were the invisible victims of the corporate machine, used to test the effects of the T-virus on developing human physiology. This was the dark secret of the orphanage, a place that promised a future but delivered only a clinical end. The prison labor experiments followed a similar logic. Inmates who were serving long sentences were offered sentence reductions in exchange for participating in medical research. These men and women were taken to hidden wings of the hospital or the underground labs, where they were exposed to weaponized viral strains. When an experiment resulted in a lethal mutation or a violent transformation, the subject was incinerated and their records were expunged. The city prison became a revolving door of human subjects, providing the combat data that would eventually lead to the creation of the Tyrant and Hunter units. These individuals were the uncounted dead, the foundation upon which Umbrella's biological empire was built. The sorrow of the disposable population is the total erasure of their humanity. These were people who had names, dreams, and histories, but in the halls of the nest, they were only data points. The fact that an orphanage and a prison were used as feeders for a bioweapon lab is the ultimate proof of the total depravity of the Umbrella Corporation. They did not just kill these people, they erased their existence from the world. When the city was eventually nuked in 1998, the world mourned the citizens, but the uncounted victims of the orphanage and the prison had been dead for years, lost in the silent dark of the corporate sub-levels. They are the ghosts of Raccoon City, the ones whose stories were never told because they were never supposed to be remembered. Part 6. The water was never safe. The total collapse of Raccoon City was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow and silent saturation of the city's lifeblood. The most disturbing fact about the outbreak is that the water supply was compromised weeks before the first report of a cannibal attack. The primary point of contamination was Ground Zero sewage, which originated from the P-12 waste incineration plant, also known as the Dead Factory. This facility was the final stop for biological waste produced by the underground laboratories. Because the volume of experimental failures became too great for the internal incinerators to handle, Umbrella personnel began to dump raw, untreated viral slurry directly into the city's sewer system. The T-virus entered the ecosystem through these subterranean arteries, turning the very infrastructure meant to protect public health into a delivery system for a global extinction event. This led to the horrifying phenomenon of the rodent vector. The rats inhabiting the sewers were the first creatures to undergo mutation through the consumption of the contaminated waste. These rodents became carriers of a hyper-aggressive strain of the T-virus, and because they utilized the residential plumbing to move between buildings, they brought the infection directly into the homes of the citizenry. Thousands of people were infected through their tap water, as the virus survived the municipal filtration systems, which were never designed to screen for engineered biological weapons. By the time the first citizen felt the fever, the T-virus was already flowing through the showerheads, the kitchen sinks, and the drinking fountains of every elementary school in the city. The outbreak did not start in the streets. It started in the bathrooms of unsuspecting families who believed their water was safe. The sorrow of the water contamination was the invisible nature of the threat. A father making coffee for his wife, or a mother bathing her newborn child, were unknowingly initiating their own transformation. This was a tactical decision by Umbrella to ensure a high density of infection before the emergency services could react. By poisoning the water, they ensured that the majority of the population would be symptomatic, simultaneously creating a level of chaos that would overwhelm the police and the hospitals. The water was the ultimate master key for the city, allowing the virus to unlock every door without a single window being broken. When the citizens finally realized the water was the source of the illness, it was already too late, as the municipal reservoirs had become massive vats of viral soup. The legacy of the water was never safe is a chilling reminder of how easily a modern civilization can be dismantled through its utilities. The citizens of Raccoon City trusted their infrastructure because they believed it was managed by professionals, but those professionals were corporate assets. The water was not just a resource, it was a weapon, and every person who took a drink was a victim of a corporate execution. This fact highlights the total lack of regard Umbrella had for the human variables in their experiment. They did not just want to study a virus. They wanted to study the total death of a city, and the water supply was the most efficient way to ensure that no one was left untouched by the rot. Part 7. Early outbreaks that were covered up. The official history of the Raccoon City incident claims that the horror began in late September 1998. But the clinical records tell a different story of early outbreaks that were covered up. Throughout the spring and summer of that year, the city experienced a series of flu season lies where hospitals were flooded with patients suffering from high fevers, skin necrosis, and violent behavioral changes. Umbrella utilized its control over the local media and the Board of Health to categorize these cases as a new strain of tropical fever or an unusual outbreak of the flu. These were in fact the results of early viral leaks from the Arklay research facility. The corporation monitored these early victims with intense interest, using them as an unintentional focus group to refine their understanding of the virus's incubation period in an urban setting. During this period, there were massive missing persons spikes that the Raccoon City Police Department was ordered to ignore. Entire families disappeared from the suburban outskirts near the mountains, but their files were routinely lost or buried by corporate operatives within the department. These individuals had not run away. They had been the first to encounter the mutated fauna of the forest, or had been picked up by Umbrella sanitation squads to be used as test subjects in the final stages of research. The city was being hollowed out from the edges inward, as the early outbreaks served as a slow burn, prelude to the final conflagration. The silence of the authorities during these months was a death sentence for the thousands who might have escaped if the truth had been made public. Furthermore, the emergency responses silenced during the summer of 1998 represent a catastrophic failure of the social contract. Individual doctors who attempted to alert the Center for Disease Control were intercepted by Umbrella security teams, and their medical licenses were revoked under the guise of mental instability. The corporation maintained a digital wall around the city, monitoring all outgoing communications and scrubbing any mention of zombies or cannibalism from the early internet forums. This was a total information blackout designed to protect the Umbrella stock price and the secrecy of the G virus project. The people of Raccoon City were living in a haunted house, and every time they tried to scream, a corporate hand was clamped over their mouths. The sorrow of the covered-up outbreaks was the missed opportunity for salvation. If the truth had been revealed in May or June, the city could have been evacuated, and the world could have been warned. Instead, the silence allowed the virus to settle into the heart of the community like a cancer. The early victims died in isolation, their stories forgotten in the rush of the final collapse. These were the pioneers of the nightmare, the ones who suffered through the first mutations without any understanding of what was happening to them. Their deaths were the data points that Umbrella used to calculate the final strike, ensuring that when the real outbreak occurred, it would be a total and irreversible catastrophe. Part 8, RPD, was not an accident. The Raccoon City Police Department headquarters was a masterpiece of structural sabotage, designed to fail during a biological crisis. The building was originally an art museum, and its renovation into a police station was personally overseen by Chief Brian Irons, with full funding from the Umbrella Corporation. While the public was told that the move was a cost-saving measure, the architectural reality was that the station was turned into a museum of control. The renovation replaced functional police corridors with a labyrinth of heavy gates, secret passages, and ornate puzzles. This was not for aesthetic reasons, but to ensure that the police force could be easily compartmentalized and neutralized. In the event of an outbreak, the officers would find themselves trapped in a building that was designed to be a tomb rather than a fortress. The interior of the station was a series of tactical bottlenecks. The main hall was a grand display of power, but the secondary exits were intentionally blocked or replaced with electronic locks that could be triggered by a central command. This meant that the officers of the RPD were effectively imprisoned within their own headquarters as the city fell. Chief Irons had the only set of keys to many of the critical areas, ensuring that he could manipulate the movements of his men to serve his own psychotic whims and Umbrella's objectives. The station was not a place of refuge for the survivors. It was a kill zone where the defenders were denied the very equipment and mobility they needed to survive. The blood on the marble floors of the RPD was the intended result of a 30-year architectural plan. Furthermore, the station served as a hub for information sabotage. The evidence rooms were not just for criminal files. They were for the suppression of any evidence linking Umbrella to the strange occurrences in the mountains. Chief Irons used the station as a processing center for corporate bribes and as a staging area for the destruction of the STARS unit. By the time the outbreak reached its peak, the RPD was a rudderless ship because its captain had been bought and paid for by the enemy. The officers who fought and died in those hallways were victims of a betrayal that was built into the very walls of their workplace. They believed they were protecting a city, but they were actually guarding a corporate secret, and the building was designed to make sure none of them lived to tell it. The sorrow of the RPD was the corruption of the badge. The police are supposed to be the line between order and chaos, but in Raccoon City, the line was drawn by Umbrella. The station remains a symbol of the total subversion of civic authority. It was an art museum turned into a police station, turned into a slaughterhouse. This fact illustrates the depth of Umbrella's infiltration into every facet of the city's life. They did not just bribe the chief they owned the building. They did not just influence the investigation. They built the maze that the investigators would die in. The RPD was not a failure of law enforcement. It was a success of corporate engineering. Part 9, STARS, was set up to die. The elite special tactics and rescue service known as STARS was never meant to be a permanent fixture of Raccoon City law enforcement. From its inception, the unit was a tactical experiment designed to provide combat data on how elite human soldiers would fare against biological organic weapons. The mission to the Arklay Mountains in July 1998 was a total mission manipulation. Umbrella operatives within the police department ensured that the Bravo team was sent in first, with sabotaged equipment and no backup, followed by the Alpha team, who were used as the primary test subjects for the Tyrant project. The goal was not to rescue the missing hikers or to investigate the mansion, but to see which viral mutations could successfully neutralize a highly trained tactical team. The tragedy of STARS was the intentional equipment failures and lack of support. The helicopters were rigged for engine failure. The communication systems were jammed by Umbrella satellites, and the supply drops were redirected to ensure the teams were always fighting from a position of weakness. This was the ultimate betrayal of the warrior class. Men and women like Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, and Barry Burton were treated as high-level laboratory rats. Their skills, their bravery, and their bonds of brotherhood were treated as variables to be measured by the observers in the secure bunkers. The mansion incident was not a tragedy of errors. It was a meticulously choreographed exercise in human sacrifice for the sake of biological benchmarking. Furthermore, the survivors of the STARS unit were systematically targeted for elimination following their escape from the mansion. The city became a prison for them as their reports were dismissed by the chief and their movements were monitored by corporate assassins. Why escape routes didn't exist was a question many of them asked, as they found themselves trapped in a city where every exit was being sealed by the military and the corporation. Umbrella could not allow the survivors of the Arklay incident to testify, so they turned Raccoon City into a final kill zone for the elite unit. The Nemesis Project was the ultimate expression of this vendetta, a biological hunter designed specifically to track and execute the remaining STARS members within the burning streets. The sorrow of the STARS was the realization that their heroism was their undoing. Because they were the best, they were chosen for the most horrific test. Their survival was an anomaly that Umbrella sought to correct with extreme prejudice. This fact highlights the cold and calculating nature of the corporate mind, where human excellence is seen only as a hurdle to be overcome by a better product. The STARS unit were the true protectors of the city, but they were fighting a war where the battlefield was rigged and the commander was the enemy. Their legacy is one of courage in the face of absolute betrayal, a group of heroes who refused to die in the maze that was built for them. Part 10. Civilian warnings that went ignored. In the final days before the total collapse of Raccoon City, the civilian population attempted to scream for help, but their civilian warnings that went ignored by a system that was already fully compromised. The emergency call centers were flooded with reports of families being torn apart in their homes, of shadows moving through the parks, and of a strange grey sickness spreading through the schools. However, the dispatchers were under strict orders from the police chief to categorize these calls as civil unrest or drug-induced hysteria. There were no sirens, no emergency broadcasts, and no evacuation orders. The citizens were left to figure out the truth for themselves, while the city's leadership was busy securing their own escape routes and corporate bonuses. The media suppression during this time was absolute. The Raccoon press and the local television stations were prohibited from reporting on the cannibal murders, under the threat of immediate closure. Journalists who tried to smuggle photographs of the infected out of the city found that the phone lines were dead and the internet was a black hole. This was not just a failure of the press, but a coordinated effort to keep the population in place until the virus had achieved a critical mass. The evacuation delays were intentional because Umbrella wanted to ensure that the city was a high-density environment for their final stage of data collection. A panicked evacuation would have ruined the laboratory conditions, and so the people were kept in their homes until the monsters were at the door. Furthermore, the small groups of survivors who tried to organize their own defenses were treated as criminals. When neighbors banded together to barricade their streets, the RPD was sent in to dismantle the barriers and arrest the leaders, citing city fire codes and public order ordinances. This was a cruel joke played on a dying population. The law was being used to prevent people from saving their own lives. By the time the military arrived to set up the perimeter, their mission was not to rescue the civilians, but to ensure that no one escaped the infection. The warnings of the people were the sound of a city dying in silence, ignored by a world that was being told that Raccoon City was simply undergoing a difficult flu season. The sorrow of the ignored warnings was the feeling of total abandonment. Imagine being in your home, hearing the screams of your neighbors, and being told by the authorities that everything is fine. This psychological warfare was as lethal as the virus itself. It broke the spirit of the city before it broke the body. This fact demonstrates the total control Umbrella had over the reality of the residents. They didn't just own the buildings and the water, they owned the truth. The citizens of Raccoon City were the variables that the corporation had already written off, and their warnings were nothing more than noise in the machinery of a global experiment. Part 11. The outbreak was studied, not stopped. The most harrowing realization for any survivor of the Raccoon City incident was that the chaos was never intended to be contained by the powers that governed the region. The outbreak was studied, not stopped, because the Umbrella Corporation viewed the collapse as a live-action laboratory experiment with a sample size of over 100,000 people. While the streets were filled with the screams of families being torn apart in their homes, a network of elite corporate operatives known as monitors were stationed in secure underground bunkers and armored surveillance hubs. These monitors were tasked with observational lab duties, utilizing the city's extensive closed-circuit television network, which had been installed during the model city renewal projects. They were not looking for survivors to rescue. They were measuring the spread velocity of the T-virus and the average time it took for a residential block to fall to a state of total biological saturation. This clinical observation turned the city into a theater of calculated cruelty, where humans were treated as variables. The monitors would often interfere with the environment to test the limits of human endurance and viral efficiency. If a group of survivors found a secure building, the observers might remotely trigger a fire alarm or disable a security gate to see how the panicked crowd would respond to an approaching pack of the infected. They recorded the effectiveness of different improvised weapons, the psychological breakdown of the local police, and the specific patterns of viral mutation in different age groups. To the men in the bunkers, the death of a child was not a tragedy, but a data point regarding the susceptibility of younger immune systems to the primary infection. This was a total abandonment of human ethics in favor of cold tactical benchmarking, ensuring that every death contributed to the refinement of the Umbrella product line. The sorrow of this period was the absolute silence from the corporate leadership. Umbrella had the resources to deploy experimental vaccines or to establish effective quarantine zones within the first 24 hours, but they purposefully withheld these assets to see how the virus would perform in an unmitigated environment. They wanted to see if a modern city could be decapitated by a biological agent alone without the need for traditional military force. By watching the city burn, they gathered the information necessary to sell the T-virus as the ultimate weapon of mass disruption. The citizens of Raccoon City died so that Umbrella could produce a better marketing brochure for rogue nations and terrorist organizations. Their struggle for life was merely the background noise for a corporate video presentation. Furthermore, the study involved the systematic betrayal of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service mercenaries. These soldiers were sent in under the guise of a rescue mission, but the monitors were actually tracking their combat performance against the biological organic weapons. The lives of the mercenaries were considered as disposable as the civilians they were protecting. Every time a squad was wiped out by a hunter or a tyrant, the observers noted the tactical flaws and the weapons used. This data was then transmitted back to the global headquarters, ensuring that the sacrifice of an entire city was translated into digital assets. Raccoon City was not a disaster to be fixed. It was a resource to be harvested until there was nothing left but ash. Part 12. Creatures released on purpose. As the urban environment reached a state of total lawlessness, the Umbrella Corporation began the second phase of their testing by initiating the tactical drop of experimental biological weapons. These were not containment failures, as the official reports later claimed they were intentional deployments of high-level combatants. During the height of the chaos on September 28th, 6T-103, Tyrant units were airdropped into various strategic locations across the city. The goal was combat benchmarking, which involved testing how these massive bioengineered soldiers would perform against modern small arms fire and coordinated police resistance. One Tyrant was specifically tasked with the infiltration of the police station to retrieve a sample of the G virus, while the others were sent to engage the remaining military units and heavy rescue teams. These deployments turned the city into a nightmare of unequal combat. The survivors who had managed to evade the slow-moving zombies were suddenly hunted by hyper-aggressive predatory machines like the Hunter Alpha and the Licker. Umbrella wanted to see how these creatures would interact in a chaotic urban landscape, and which ones would establish dominance over specific territories. The release of the Hunters was a particularly brutal experiment, designed to measure the effectiveness of pack hunters in clearing out high-density apartment complexes. The corporation observed as these monsters bypassed barricades and executed entire families with surgical precision. These were not escapes, they were field tests. The city was being used to create a catalogue of lethality, where every monster was graded on its kill-to-cost ratio. The most terrifying of these purposeful releases was the Nemesis T type of pursuit model, specifically programmed to hunt and eliminate the surviving members of the STARS unit. This was not just about data. It was about erasing the witnesses of the Arclay incident. The Nemesis was a testament to the sophistication of the Umbrella research, allowing the corporation to test a high-level biological assassin in a real-world urban warfare scenario. The observers watched as the creature utilized heavy weaponry and tactical intelligence to pursue its targets through the burning streets. This provided invaluable data on the integration of organic and synthetic systems, proving that a biological weapon could be just as precise as a guided missile. The people of Raccoon City were the bystanders in a high-stakes game of monster versus soldier, where the outcome was always rigged in favor of the corporation. The sorrow of the purposeful release was the feeling of being hunted by something that should not exist. A father trying to protect his children from a zombie might have a chance, but against a tyrant or a hunter, there was no hope. These creatures represented the total dehumanization of the conflict. The city was no longer a human space, it was an arena for monsters. This fact highlights the absolute arrogance of Umbrella believing they could control the chaos they had unleashed. They treated the city like a giant cage, and the residents like the live bait. Every creature released was a nail in the coffin of Raccoon City, ensuring that no one who saw the truth would live to tell the world what Umbrella had truly become. Part 13. Civilians were used as bait. One of the most disgusting facts about the collapse was the intentional creation of false sanctuaries, where survivors were herded for the purpose of biological testing. The radio broadcasts and emergency posters that instructed citizens to gather at designated evacuation zones were often traps set by Umbrella operatives and the compromised city leadership. These zones were not safety hubs, but kill zones, where the corporation had already pre-positioned biological weapons to test their predatory efficiency on large groups of panicked people. For example, the Raccoon City Zoo and the St. Michael's Clock Tower were broadcast as rescue points, but they were actually enclosed environments where survivors could be easily monitored as they were hunted by hunters or the infected wildlife. This herding of the population served two purposes. First, it cleared the residential streets for more refined tactical testing, and second, it provided a high density of subjects for mass infection studies. Survivors who made it to these zones found themselves trapped behind locked gates and reinforced barriers as the very people who had promised them rescue watched from behind two-way mirrors. The psychological trauma of realizing that your sanctuary is a slaughterhouse was a variable that Umbrella studied with intense interest. They wanted to know the exact point at which a group of humans would turn on each other when faced with an unstoppable biological threat. The rescue was a lie told to ensure that the data collection was as orderly and efficient as possible. The use of civilians as bait also extended to the movement of the G-virus samples. Umbrella suspected that rival corporations or government agents might try to steal their research during the chaos. To counter this, they leaked false information about the location of the virus into survivor groups, knowing that the movements of these people would draw the attention of their enemies. The survivors were unknowingly acting as decoys, leading the corporate assassins and the military into traps where they could be neutralized by the city's more dangerous inhabitants. Human life was the cheapest resource Umbrella had, and they used it to shield their precious data at every turn. A mother holding her child in a dark corner of the subway was not a soul to be saved. She was a heat signature to be used as a distraction. The sorrow of being used as bait was the total destruction of hope. Imagine the relief of seeing a rescue sign, only to find that the doors are locked from the outside and the shadows are moving. This was the ultimate betrayal of the social contract. The people of Raccoon City were told that if they followed the rules, they would be safe, but the rules were written by the monsters. This fact proves that the Umbrella Corporation viewed the human race not as their customers, but as their raw materials. They had spent decades building the city into a trap, and the evacuation zones were the final snap of the jaw. By the time the citizens realized they were bait, there was no one left to call for help. Part 14. The military did not act immediately. The failure of the federal government to respond to the Raccoon City crisis was not an accident of bureaucracy, but a result of deliberate jurisdiction conflicts and political manipulation. Despite the early reports of a catastrophic biological event, the orders to deploy the military were delayed for days. This was partly due to Umbrella's high-level lobbying and the secret contracts the corporation held with the Department of Defense. The government was terrified that a full military intervention would expose their own illegal research partnerships with Umbrella. As a result, the response was paralyzed by a debate over whether the situation was a local law enforcement issue or a national security threat. While the politicians in Washington argued over legal definitions, the people of Raccoon City were being consumed by the virus. This delay allowed Umbrella to execute its final data collection protocols and extraction missions. The military units that were eventually sent to the perimeter were given contradictory orders that prioritized containment over rescue. Soldiers were told that the city was a hot zone for a highly contagious and lethal pathogen, and they were ordered to shoot anyone attempting to cross the quarantine line. This turned the military into the jailers of a dying city. The soldiers on the ground often wanted to help the civilians they saw pleading at the fences, but their orders were absolute. The politics of the situation had designated the survivors as biological hazards rather than citizens deserving of protection. The delay was a death sentence for the thousands who could have been saved if the military had acted with the speed and decisiveness they were capable of. Furthermore, the military units that did enter the city were often under the command of officers who had been briefed on the biological nature of the threat, but were denied the proper equipment to handle it. They were sent into a meat grinder without the tactical data they needed to survive. This was because the government also wanted to see how its own soldiers would perform against the BOWs. The military intervention was just another layer of the experiment, a test of how a conventional army handles an unconventional biological apocalypse. The soldiers were just as expendable as the civilians they were meant to protect. By the time the true scale of the disaster was acknowledged, the only remaining option was the total destruction of the city to cover up the evidence of the government's complicity. The sorrow of the military failure was the sight of the American flag at the city gates, not as a sign of salvation, but as a barrier to freedom. The survivors who reached the perimeter believed they were finally safe, only to find themselves staring down the barrels of their own country's rifles. This fact demonstrates the total collapse of the moral authority of the state. The government had become a partner in the corporate crime, and their response was a frantic attempt to hide the bodies before the world could see the truth. The military did not fail because of incompetence. They failed because they were ordered to wait until it was too late to do anything but incinerate the evidence. Part 15. The truth about the nuclear strike. The final act of the Raccoon City tragedy was the thermobaric strike on October 1st, 1998, an event officially known as the Mission of Mercy. However, the truth about the strike was far more sinister than a simple act of containment. The decision to incinerate the city was not made to save the world from the virus, but to erase the evidence of umbrellas, 30-year history of illegal experimentation, and the government's role in supporting it. By the time the strike was authorized, the virus had already begun to spread beyond the city limits via the water table and the wildlife. The nuke was not a cure. It was a forensic cleanup. It was the only way to ensure that the secret laboratories, the experimental data, and the thousands of human remains could never be analyzed by an independent international commission. The launch of the missile was a cold and calculated last-minute retrieval operation. The strike was delayed for several hours, specifically to allow umbrella cleaners and high-level executives to finish extracting the most critical research data and G-virus samples from the underground nest. While the countdown was active, the corporation was busy loading digital archives and viral vials onto stealth helicopters, while the remaining survivors were left to watch the sky. The lives of the remaining citizens were measured against the time needed to upload a few more gigabytes of combat data. The government and the corporation worked in tandem to ensure that the city was destroyed at the exact moment the research was safe and the witnesses were dead. This was the final betrayal, a cleansing fire designed to protect the guilty and bury the innocent. Furthermore, the thermobaric strike was chosen specifically for its ability to vaporize organic matter without leaving a radioactive signature that would draw too much global attention. It was a surgical tool for a corporate cover-up. The official narrative was that the city was destroyed to prevent a global pandemic, but the reality was that the pandemic had already begun, and the strike was just a way to shift the blame onto a tragic accident rather than a systematic corporate crime. The survivors who managed to escape the blast zone were left with the knowledge that their home was not destroyed by a monster, but by a committee of men in suits who decided that their lives were less valuable than a corporate secret. The fire was the final lock on the door of the laboratory, ensuring that the truth would stay buried in the crater. The sorrow of the nuclear strike was the absolute finality of the erasure. An entire culture, a city's history, and the lives of 100,000 people were turned into a pillar of fire in a matter of seconds. This fact is the ultimate testament to the scale of the Raccoon City tragedy. It was a city that was sacrificed on the altar of progress and then incinerated to hide the blood. The nuke didn't just kill the infected, it killed the memories of the victims. The truth about the strike is that it was the final success of the Umbrella Corporation, a perfect exit strategy that allowed them to walk away from the ashes with their research intact and their hands clean in the eyes of the law. Part 16. Survivors who were silenced. The true horror of the Raccoon City incident did not end when the thermobaric missile impacted the city center. For the small percentage of the population that managed to escape the blast zone, a new nightmare began in the form of witness intimidation and the systematic erasure of their testimonies. These individuals, having seen the Umbrella logo on the crates of biological weapons and the mutated horrors in the streets, were viewed by the United States government and the Umbrella Corporation as a primary threat to national security. Instead of receiving medical care and psychological support, the survivors were funneled into high-security debriefing centers, where they were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements under the threat of permanent detention or death. The survivors were told that their experiences were the result of a chemical plant explosion and mass hysteria, and any deviation from this official narrative would result in their immediate disappearance. This silencing process was characterized by forced NDA agreements that stripped the victims of their right to seek justice. Many of the survivors were relocated to remote parts of the country with new identities, effectively cutting them off from their past lives and any fellow witnesses who could corroborate their stories. The corporation utilized its vast network of private investigators to monitor these individuals for years, ensuring that no one spoke to the press or attempted to publish their memoirs. This led to a series of disappearances after rescue, where survivors who attempted to go public with the truth were found dead in suspicious accidents or simply vanished from their new homes. The message was clear: the city was gone, and the truth was intended to stay in the crater. The survivors were not treated as heroes or victims, but as loose ends in a corporate cover-up that spanned the globe. Furthermore, the psychological toll of this silence was devastating. Imagine escaping a literal hell on earth only to be told by your own government that what you saw did not happen. This gaslighting of an entire survivor population led to high rates of suicide, depression, and chronic fear. The people of Raccoon City were denied the communal grieving process that follows a natural disaster because their disaster was a classified secret. They were forced to carry the weight of the 100,000 dead in total isolation, knowing that if they spoke the names of the lost, they would be next. This was the final stage of the Raccoon City experiment, a study in how effectively a state can suppress the collective memory of a mass casualty event. The survivors were the living dead, ghosts of a city that the world was being told had never truly suffered a biological apocalypse. The sorrow of the silenced survivors is the loss of the human record. Because the truth was suppressed, the lessons of Raccoon City were never fully integrated into public policy or international law until it was too late for other regions. The silence protected the guilty and allowed Umbrella to continue its operations under different names for years. These survivors are the forgotten soldiers of the biohazard war, individuals who saw the abyss and were then forbidden from warning anyone else about what lived at the bottom. Their silence is the most powerful weapon Umbrella ever produced, a tactical erasure of reality that persists to this day in the redacted files of the global intelligence community. Part 17, the cover-up, was global. The scale of the Raccoon City disaster was so immense that it required a global cover-up to prevent a total collapse of public trust in the international pharmaceutical and defense industries. Following the destruction of the city, Umbrella Corporation utilized its vast financial resources to initiate a media rewriting campaign of unprecedented proportions. News agencies across the world were fed a consistent narrative that Raccoon City was the victim of a tragic accidental leakage of volatile industrial chemicals, combined with a rare and localized viral outbreak that was successfully contained by the heroic actions of the corporate security teams. Photographs of zombies were dismissed as digital forgeries or the result of a fringe religious cult's mass suicide. By flooding the information space with conflicting reports and fake experts, Umbrella made the truth feel like a conspiracy theory. This campaign involved a strategy of blame shifting, where the corporation identified a few low-level employees and local officials to serve as the fall guys for the entire catastrophe. The public was told that the incident was the result of individual negligence rather than a systemic corporate policy of bioweapon development. Meanwhile, the Umbrella assets protected during this time were staggering. Despite the global outcry, the company was allowed to continue its core operations for years because its research was too valuable to the world's superpowers. The international community was complicit in this silence, as many nations were secretly bidding for the research data that had been extracted from the city before the strike. The cover-up was not just a corporate effort, it was a global agreement to look the other way in exchange for the keys to the next generation of biological warfare. Furthermore, the digital footprints of the incident were systematically scrubbed from the early internet. Umbrella hired teams of hackers and data specialists to delete forum posts, private emails, and independent news blogs that contained eyewitness accounts or leaked corporate documents. This was one of the first major examples of large-scale digital information warfare. The world was being gaslit on a global scale, and for a long time, the strategy worked. The tragedy of Raccoon City became a footnote in the history of the late 20th century, a strange anomaly that was quickly forgotten as the world moved into the new millennium. This global silence ensured that the blueprint for terror remained in the hands of the elite, ready to be used again when the time was right. The sorrow of the global cover-up is the realization that justice is often a matter of geography and economics. Because Umbrella was a global titan, they could buy the silence of entire nations. The victims of Raccoon City were not just betrayed by their neighbors and their city, they were betrayed by the entire human family. The cover-up was the ultimate victory for the corporate mind, proving that if a lie is big enough and backed by enough capital, it becomes the truth. Raccoon City was a warning that the world ignored because it was more comfortable to believe the lie. This fact serves as a chilling reminder that the history we are taught is often just the version of the past that was bought and paid for by the winners of the previous war. Part 18. The data was reused. The destruction of Raccoon City was not the end of the research, but rather the beginning of its most profitable phase. The data was reused by a multitude of organizations that rose from the ashes of the Umbrella Corporation. When Umbrella finally fell in 2003, its intellectual property did not vanish. It was sold, stolen, or absorbed into the black budget programs of various governments and rival pharmaceutical giants like Tricell and the Connections. The combat data harvested by the monitors, recording the spread of the virus, the mutation patterns in an urban environment, and the effectiveness of the BOW drops became the foundational library for modern bioterrorism. Every major outbreak in the 21st century can be traced back to the lessons learned in the streets of Raccoon City. This reuse of data is why Raccoon City mattered so much to the global military-industrial complex. It provided the first real-world proof of concept for the total decapitation of a metropolitan area through biological means. The information regarding how a civilian population collapses, how emergency services fail, and how a city becomes a self-sustaining engine of infection was invaluable to those who wished to weaponize chaos. The victims of the 1998 incident were essentially the involuntary beta testers for the global bioweapon market. Their suffering refined the viral strains and tactical deployments that would later haunt cities in Africa, Europe, and Asia. The city was a sacrifice made to build a dictionary of death that is still being written to this day. Furthermore, the data taught the world's power players how to manage the aftermath of a biological disaster. The success of the Raccoon City cover-up provided a template for how to use media suppression, forensic incineration, and legal shielding to protect the perpetrators of mass casualty events. Modern organizations have learned that the key to a successful biological attack is not just the virus itself, but the control of the narrative that follows. The data from Raccoon City taught them how to hide in plain sight, how to manipulate the international community, and how to use a catastrophe as a tool for corporate or political restructuring. The city died so that the elite could learn how to kill without consequence. The sorrow of the reused data is the fact that the dead of Raccoon City are still being used. Every time a new BOW is engineered using a variant of the T virus or the G virus, a piece of the city's agony is being replicated for profit. The victims never truly found rest because their biological history was turned into a commodity. This fact demonstrates the ultimate depravity of the bioweapon industry, where even the end of a world is seen as an opportunity for market expansion. Raccoon City was the 0 point, the baseline of a new era of horror, and as long as that data exists, the city will continue to die over and over again in laboratories across the globe. Part 19. Justice never came. Perhaps the most bitter truth of the Raccoon City incident is that justice never came for the people who orchestrated the massacre. While the Umbrella Corporation was eventually dismantled, the high-level executives and scientists responsible for the 30-year experiment in the Arklay Mountains largely escaped any meaningful punishment. Many of them utilized their wealth to flee to non-extradition territories, or used their knowledge of classified biological programs to negotiate immunity deals with various governments. These men, who had overseen the poisoning of the water and the release of the tyrants, were allowed to live out their lives in luxury, while the families they destroyed were forgotten. There were no real trials for the architects of the apocalypse, only bureaucratic reshuffling and corporate rebranding. The lack of accountability was a result of the fact that the governments were complicit in the crime. A full and transparent trial of the Umbrella leadership would have required the United States government to admit to its own illegal contracts and research partnerships with the corporation. To protect the state, the legal process was intentionally obstructed, and the scope of the investigation was limited to a few rogue elements. This ensured that the systemic rot remained intact. The executives who escaped were often absorbed into black-budget research programs under different names, continuing the same work they had started in Raccoon City, but with even less oversight. The victims were treated as collateral damage in a game of global power, and their desire for justice was viewed as a threat to the stability of the international order. Furthermore, the survivors who attempted to bring lawsuits against the remaining fragments of Umbrella found themselves facing an impenetrable wall of corporate lawyers and government non-disclosure orders. The legal system proved to be just as much of a trap as the RPD station, designed to exhaust the resources of the victims and protect the assets of the powerful. By the time any significant legal progress was made, the company had been dissolved and its leadership had vanished into the shadows of the global economy. This total failure of justice sent a clear message to the world that if you are powerful enough and your research is valuable enough, you are above the law. The victims of Raccoon City were denied even the small comfort of seeing their tormentors in a cage. The sorrow of the missing justice is the feeling of a world that has lost its moral compass. It tells us that the lives of 100,000 ordinary people are worth less than the secrets of a few powerful men. This fact is the final insult to the memory of the city, a confirmation that the world chose the virus over the truth. The lack of justice allowed the cycle of biological terror to continue, as other corporations and regimes realized they could commit similar atrocities with minimal risk of accountability. Raccoon City remains an open wound in the conscience of humanity, a place where the guilty walked free and the innocent were burned twice, once by the fire and once by the law. Part 20. The city that never truly died. The final fact in this analysis is the disturbing reality that Raccoon City remains a part of our world, a city that never truly died. To this day, the location where the city once stood is a restricted no-fly zone, patrolled by international monitoring teams and private security contractors. Despite the nuclear sanitization, the area is not a barren wasteland. It is an overgrown, lush, and biologically active nightmare. The thermobaric strike may have destroyed the buildings, but it could not fully neutralize the viral legacy that had permeated the deep soil and the subterranean water table. The site is a permanent reminder that you cannot nuke away a legacy of corporate evil. It is a no man's land where the earth itself has become a biohazard. The area is essentially an eternal ghost, a geographic scar that continues to influence the modern era. Scientists who monitor the perimeter have reported anomalous biological signatures and strange mutations in the local flora, indicating that the T virus remnants are still active and evolving within the crater. This makes the Raccoon City site a permanent monument to the arrogance of the 1990s, a place where the air still carries the weight of the lost. The blueprint for terror that the city provided continues to fuel the global bioweapon market, as the combat data harvested there remains the industry standard for urban biological warfare. The city didn't die. It mutated into a global phenomenon of fear and insecurity. Furthermore, the legacy of the city lives on in the stories of the survivors and the redacted files of the agencies that replaced Umbrella. Raccoon City is the ghost that haunts every new outbreak, the standard by which every new biological disaster is measured. It is the proof that a modern civilization can be dismantled in a matter of days, and that the institutions we trust to protect us can be turned into the instruments of our destruction. The city remains a blueprint for future disasters, a warning that we have yet to truly heed. As long as the research from the nest exists in the hands of the elite, the spirit of Raccoon City is still alive, waiting for the next gate to be opened and the next lock to be picked. The sorrow of the city that never died is the realization that we are still living in its shadow. The fences around the crater are the only thing keeping the past from reclaiming the future. But the virus of corporate greed and scientific hubris has already spread far beyond the Arklay Mountains. Raccoon City is a permanent part of the human psyche now, a place of fire and shadow that reminds us of the absolute cost of our pursuit of power. It is a city that will never be rebuilt, a memory that will never be erased, and a warning that will never stop being relevant. The city is gone, but the lesson remains, written in the ash and the soil of a Midwest valley that the world tried to forget.